The coffee cup slipped from Benjamin Matthews' weathered hands, ceramic shattering against the forest floor, as 800 pounds of grizzly bear emerged from the tree line 20 feet away. This wasn't supposed to happen. Bears avoided humans, especially lone men sitting in remote clearings at dawn. Sarah Mitchell's binoculars hit the ground behind a distant pine, her sharp intake of breath cutting through the morning silence like a knife, while Vincent Crawford's radio crackled with forgotten urgency in his trembling grip. Ben's throat constricted as he recognized the distinctive reddish patch of fur, the familiar gait that had haunted his dreams for 8 long years. The cub he'd bottle-fed through countless sleepless nights. Now, a massive predator studying him with intelligent amber eyes. "Ruby," he whispered, his voice breaking on a name he'd spoken to no one. The bear tilted her massive head, took one deliberate step forward. What bond could survive 8 years of separation, and was he about to discover if love truly transcends species, or if his past had finally come to claim him? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 8 years earlier, Benjamin Matthews had believed in rules the way other men believed in God, absolutely and without question. At 44, he was Yellowstone's most dependable ranger, the man supervisors called when protocols needed following and difficult decisions required steady hands. His 20-year career had been built on predictability: morning patrols at 5:30, incident reports filed by noon, home to his empty cabin by dark. The divorce papers had arrived on a Tuesday, delivered to the ranger station while Ben inventoried emergency supplies. Margaret's lawyer-written words were clinical, efficient: irreconcilable differences, and failure to prioritize marriage. She'd taken their shared dreams of children, their house in town, everything except his uniform, and the hollow ache that settled behind his ribs like a permanent resident. Vincent Crawford, the park's 62-year-old superintendent, had hired Ben straight from college, molding him into the perfect government employee. Vincent ran Yellowstone like a military operation, every bear encounter documented, every visitor interaction regulated, every decision filtered through decades of bureaucratic wisdom. "Nature doesn't need our help," Vincent would say, his scarred face stern beneath graying hair. "Our job is to observe and protect, not interfere." But Vincent's philosophy carried darker undertones that most employees never understood. Behind his methodical approach lurked a bone-deep terror of grizzly bears, though he'd never explained why his left hand sometimes trembled when reviewing bear activity reports, or why he required rangers to carry bear spray even in headquarters. The small gateway town of Cedar Falls survived on tourist dollars and stubborn hope. 800 residents clung to Main Street businesses that struggled through harsh winters and brief summer booms. Sarah Mitchell's Morning Glory Diner served as the community's unofficial headquarters where locals debated park policies over coffee and pie. At 68, Sarah had weathered 4 decades of seasonal uncertainty, raising 2 children who'd fled to Denver the moment they graduated high school. Sarah had watched Ben deteriorate through his divorce, serving him increasingly silent breakfasts as his marriage crumbled. She recognized the hollow look of a man whose life had become an empty routine, though she kept her observations to herself. In small towns, everyone's business was everyone's burden. Ben's cabin sat on 5 acres of park-adjacent land, inherited from his grandfather, the only family connection he maintained. Evenings found him on the porch, listening to the wilderness that had become his sole companion. He'd stopped calling friends months ago, stopped attending the monthly poker games that had once provided human connection. Work filled his days. Loneliness shaped his nights. Margaret had accused him of loving the forest more than her, and Ben couldn't argue. Trees didn't leave. Mountains didn't file divorce papers. Wildlife followed predictable patterns that made sense, unlike human relationships that seemed designed to disappoint. That spring, as snowmelt swelled the rivers and early wildflowers pushed through thawing soil, Ben Matthews had no idea that breaking his most sacred rule would either destroy him completely or save what remained of his heart. The storm hit Yellowstone on a Thursday in late May, 3 weeks after Ben's divorce became final. What started as spring rain turned vicious by midnight, driving horizontal sheets against his cabin windows, while wind screamed through the pines like something wounded and wild. By morning, the Weather Service was calling it a 100-year event, the kind of storm that rewrote landscapes and left scars across generations. Ben's radio crackled to life at dawn with Vincent's clipped voice requesting damage assessment on the northern backcountry trails. "Probably just downed trees and washouts," Vincent said, though his tone carried the tension it always did when discussing remote areas where grizzlies denned. "Take the ATV as far as Beaver Creek, then hike the rest. Standard protocol, observe and report, nothing more." The ATV's engine echoed off canyon walls as Ben navigated muddy service roads littered with fallen branches. Storm damage was worse than he'd expected. Ancient pines uprooted like matchsticks, their massive root systems exposed like grasping fingers. Creek beds had become torrents, carving new channels through meadows that had remained unchanged for decades. At Beaver Creek, Ben parked and shouldered his pack, following the trail that wound toward the high country where few tourists ventured. The path had become an obstacle course of deadfall and washouts, forcing him to bushwhack through dense underbrush that soaked his uniform with leftover rainwater. 2 hours in, he heard it, a sound so soft he almost missed it beneath the whisper of wind through damaged trees. A whimper, weak, desperate, barely audible. Ben froze, listening. The sound came again, from somewhere ahead and to his left, beyond a massive fallen cedar that blocked the trail. He approached slowly, pushing through tangled branches, and stopped dead when he saw her. The grizzly cub lay curled against the base of the fallen tree, no bigger than a golden retriever puppy. Her dark brown fur was matted with mud and dried blood, one hind paw bent at an unnatural angle. She was breathing, but barely, shallow, labored pants that fogged the cool morning air. One eye was swollen shut from what looked like a blow to the head. Ben's training kicked in immediately. Protocol was clear: do not approach injured wildlife. Bears, even cubs, were dangerous and unpredictable. Wildlife Services handled all animal emergencies. His job was to radio for assistance and maintain safe distance until professionals arrived. But as he reached for his radio, the cub lifted her head slightly and looked directly at him. Her one good eye was amber-colored, bright with intelligence and something that looked disturbingly like hope. She didn't growl or show fear, just watched him with the trusting gaze of something too young to know that humans meant danger. Ben found himself stepping closer before he realized he'd moved. The cub's breathing was increasingly shallow, and he could see dried blood crusted around a wound on her left paw. Nearby, partially hidden beneath fallen branches, he spotted the remains of an adult female grizzly, the cub's mother, killed when the massive cedar had crashed down during the storm. "Jesus," Ben whispered, understanding flooding through him. The cub had been trapped beside her dead mother for hours, possibly all night, growing weaker with each passing moment. Wildlife Services was 3 hours away by good roads, and the storm had made some routes impassable. By the time help arrived, she'd be dead. Ben stared at the dying cub and saw his own childhood reflected in her desperate eyes. 5 years old, standing beside his mother's hospital bed while machines beeped their electronic requiems. His father reeking of whiskey and cheap cologne, explaining through tears that sometimes people died and little boys had to be brave. the crushing weight of abandonment, of being too small to save the one person who mattered most. "Okay, little one," Ben heard himself saying, surprising both of them. "I'm going to help you." He approached slowly, hands visible, speaking in the same gentle tone he'd once used to calm spooked horses. The cub watched his approach but didn't struggle. She was too weak for fight or flight. When Ben knelt beside her, she made a small sound that might have been relief. Working carefully, Ben examined her injuries. The paw was definitely broken, but the bone hadn't broken through skin. The head injury looked worse than it was. Scalp wounds always bled dramatically. Dehydration and hypothermia were the immediate threats. She needed warmth, fluids, and medical attention in that order. Ben wrapped the cub in his uniform jacket, surprised by how little she weighed. Maybe 15 pounds, all bones and matted fur. She settled against his chest with a small sigh, seeking warmth from his body heat. The walk back to his ATV took an hour, with Ben stopping frequently to let the cub rest and to check that she was still breathing. At his cabin, Ben converted his garage into a makeshift veterinary clinic. He'd grown up on his grandfather's ranch, had assisted with enough injured animals to know the basics. Clean water first, then warmth, then food. The cub's body temperature was dangerously low. Ben could feel her shivering against his chest as he carried her inside. He lined a large cardboard box with old blankets and placed her near his wood stove, close enough for warmth but not so close that she'd overheat. From his first aid kit, he retrieved supplies to clean her wounds, antibacterial solution, gauze, medical tape. The cub remained docile throughout his ministrations, as if she understood he was trying to help. The real challenge was food. Bear cubs nursed for their first few months, transitioning gradually to solid food. Ben had no bear milk, no wildlife formula, no idea what to feed a creature caught between infancy and independence. He settled on warm goat's milk mixed with honey. Not perfect, but the closest thing to natural bear milk he could create. Getting her to drink required patience. Ben dipped his finger in the mixture and let her lick it, gradually coaxing her to lap from a shallow bowl. When she finally began drinking on her own, the relief that flooded through him was almost overwhelming. For the first time since finding her, Ben allowed himself to believe she might survive. That first night he slept on his couch with one ear tuned to the garage, checking on her every few hours. By morning she was stronger, lifting her head when he entered, watching his movements with alert curiosity. When he offered the milk mixture, she drank eagerly, even attempting to stand on her 3 good legs. "You're going to make it, aren't you?" Ben said softly, running his hand gently over her fur. She leaned into his touch, making a small, rumbling sound that might have been contentment. Ben knew he should call wildlife services, report the injured cub, follow protocol. But something held him back, maybe the way she looked at him with complete trust, or the way caring for her had given him the first sense of purpose he'd felt in months. One more day, he told himself, just to make sure she's stable. One day became 2, then 3. The cub grew stronger, more alert, more attached to the man who fed her and tended her wounds. Ben found himself talking to her as he worked, sharing the loneliness and disappointment that had been eating at him since Margaret left. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said one evening, watching her lap milk from her bowl with increasing coordination. "I never wanted kids, told Margaret I wasn't father material. But here I am playing mama bear to an actual bear." The cub looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, tilted her head as if considering his words. In that moment, Ben realized 2 things. He'd never felt more needed in his entire life, and he was in serious trouble. Because somewhere between the first bottle feeding and the way she whimpered when he left for work each morning, Ben Matthews had done the one thing every ranger manual warned against. He'd formed an emotional attachment to a wild animal, and it was going to break both their hearts. 3 weeks into his secret life as surrogate bear parent, Ben had fallen into a routine that felt more natural than anything he'd experienced in years. He woke before dawn to feed Ruby. He'd finally given her a name after noticing the distinctive reddish patch of fur on her chest, then spent his days on regular ranger duties while she slept in the converted garage. Evenings found them on his back porch, Ruby exploring the enclosed area he'd created while Ben watched her clumsy attempts at climbing and digging. She'd grown remarkably in those 3 weeks. Her broken paw had healed enough for her to walk with only a slight limp, and her coat had regained its healthy shine. More importantly, she'd bonded with Ben in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. She followed him everywhere, whimpering when he left for work, greeting his return with excited vocalizations that sounded almost like purring. At night she slept curled against his feet, as if ensuring he wouldn't disappear while she dreamed. The routine shattered on a Tuesday morning when Sarah Mitchell arrived unannounced with a basket of leftover muffins and the kind of determined expression that had made her the unofficial mother of Cedar Falls for 4 decades. "Benjamin Matthews, you open this door right now," Sarah called from his front porch. "I've been watching you sneak around like some kind of criminal, and I'm not leaving until you tell me what's going on." Ben peered through his bedroom window, heart hammering. Ruby was napping in her box in the garage, but Sarah's voice had a carrying quality that could wake the dead. Through the window he could see Sarah's compact figure planted firmly on his porch, arms crossed in the universal posture of a woman who would not be denied. "Just a minute, Sarah," Ben called, pulling on his uniform shirt. His mind raced through possible explanations, each more implausible than the last. Sarah Mitchell had raised 2 children and run a small-town diner for 40 years. She could spot a lie from 3 counties away. When he opened the door, Sarah pushed past him with the casual authority of someone who'd been mothering reluctant men since the Carter administration. She set her muffin basket on his kitchen counter and turned to face him, her gray eyes sharp with concern. "You look like hell, Ben," she said without preamble. "Lost weight? Bags under your eyes, and you've been buying enough milk to supply a daycare center. Mary Henderson at the grocery store says you're going through 5 gallons a week." Ben's stomach dropped. In a town of 800 people, unusual purchasing patterns were front-page news at the Morning Glory Diner. "I've been eating more cereal," he offered weakly. Sarah's expression could have melted steel. "Benjamin Franklin Matthews, I changed your diapers when you were too small to lie convincingly, and you're not much better at it now. What are you hiding in that garage?" Before Ben could answer, a soft whimpering sound drifted through the walls. Ruby calling for him, as she did every morning when she woke and found herself alone. Sarah's eyebrows shot toward her hairline. "Please tell me that's not what I think it is," she said slowly. Ben's shoulders sagged in defeat. 3 weeks of carefully maintained secrecy crumbled in the face of Sarah's maternal determination. "Promise me you won't call Vincent," he said quietly. "Oh, honey," Sarah breathed, understanding flooding her weathered features. "What have you done?" He led her to the garage, where Ruby was standing in her enclosure, balanced on her hind legs with front paws pressed against the chicken wire fencing. At the sight of Ben, she made the rumbling sound that had become their greeting ritual. Sarah stopped dead in the doorway. "Sweet Jesus and all the angels," she whispered. "Ben, that's a grizzly bear cub." "Her name is Ruby," Ben said, surprising himself with the defensiveness in his voice. "I found her after the storm, trapped under a fallen tree next to her dead mother. She was dying, Sarah. Wildlife Services would have taken 3 hours to respond, and she would have been dead by then." Ruby had noticed Sarah now and was studying her with curious amber eyes, head tilted in the way that made her look almost puppy-like. Sarah took a tentative step forward, then another, until she was close enough to see the healing scar on Ruby's left paw and the intelligence in her gaze. "She's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "And she loves you. Look at how she watches you." As if to prove Sarah's point, Ruby made soft vocalizations until Ben approached her enclosure. She pressed her nose through the wire, seeking contact with the man who'd saved her life. Ben obligingly scratched behind her ears, and Ruby's rumbling grew louder. "This is insane, Ben," Sarah said, but her voice held wonder rather than condemnation. "If Vincent finds out, he'll destroy you. You know how he feels about bears." Ben nodded grimly. "I know. But Sarah, I can't just abandon her. She trusts me. And honestly," he paused, watching Ruby nuzzle his hand through the wire, "taking care of her has saved me as much as I saved her." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the unlikely pair. Finally, she sighed deeply and set down her purse. "Well then," she said briskly, "we'd better figure out how to keep both of you alive." Sarah Mitchell became Ben's unlikely co-conspirator in the most elaborate deception Cedar Falls had ever witnessed. What started as a promise to keep his secret evolved into active participation in Ruby's care, as Sarah discovered that nurturing the orphaned cub filled a void in her own heart that had ached since her children left for the city and her husband passed 5 years earlier. "Bears are just big dogs with attitude," Sarah declared on her third visit, watching Ruby play with a rope toy she'd brought from the hardware store. "My grandmother used to say any creature that could love was worth loving back." The conspiracy required careful coordination. Sarah began making regular supply runs to neighboring towns, purchasing formula, medical supplies, and eventually solid food as Ruby grew. She told curious neighbors she was helping care for injured wildlife at an undisclosed location, technically true if deliberately vague. Ben modified his work schedule to spend lunch breaks at home, ensuring Ruby wasn't alone for more than 4 hours at a time. As summer progressed, Ruby transformed from weak cub to energetic juvenile bear. By July, she weighed 40 pounds and had outgrown her garage enclosure. Ben constructed a larger outdoor pen behind his cabin, hidden from the main road by dense pine trees. Ruby spent her days exploring every inch of her expanded territory, practicing the skills that would eventually ensure her survival in the wild: digging, climbing, foraging for insects and grubs. The bond between Ben and Ruby deepened in ways that defied his understanding of animal behavior. She responded to her name, came when called, and seemed to understand complex, verbal instructions. When Ben said inside, she would head toward the garage. Quiet meant she should stop vocalizing. Most remarkably, she appeared to recognize his emotional states, becoming subdued when he was stressed and playful when his mood lifted. "She reads you like a book," Sarah observed one evening, watching Ruby rest her massive head against Ben's knee while he reviewed work reports. "That's not normal bear behavior, is it?" Ben stroked Ruby's ears absently, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "Nothing about this situation is normal," he admitted. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe normal isn't always right." The first serious scare came in early August, when Vincent Crawford made an unexpected visit to Ben's cabin. Ben was in his backyard with Ruby when he heard Vincent's truck engine approaching on the gravel driveway. Panic flooded through him as he realized Ruby was in full view of anyone approaching the house. "Ruby, inside! Now!" Ben commanded urgently. The cub, sensing his distress, immediately bounded toward the garage. Ben slammed the door just as Vincent's boots crunched on the front porch. "Matthews, you home?" Vincent's voice carried the authority of 2 decades in federal service. Ben appeared at the front door, hoping his racing heartbeat wasn't visible in his expression. "Vincent, what brings you out here?" Ben asked, stepping onto the porch and pulling the door closed behind him, a gesture he hoped appeared casual rather than protective. "Routine check-in," Vincent replied, though his eyes swept the property with professional thoroughness. "You've seemed distracted lately, making sure everything's all right." For 20 minutes they discussed work schedules and upcoming tourist season challenges, while Ben fought the urge to glance toward the garage. Ruby remained mercifully quiet, though Ben could imagine her confusion at being suddenly confined. When Vincent finally left, Ben waited until the truck disappeared before releasing Ruby, who greeted him with obvious relief and mild reproach for the unexpected imprisonment. "We're getting too comfortable," Ben told Sarah the next morning over coffee at her diner. "Vincent's suspicious about something." Sarah's weathered hands wrapped around her coffee mug, steam rising between them like morning mist. "Maybe it's time to consider what comes next," she said gently. "Ruby's getting big, Ben. She needs more space, more stimulation. And you need to think about what happens when winter comes." The question Ben had been avoiding confronted him with unavoidable logic. Ruby was now a 50-pound adolescent bear with boundless energy and growing strength. Her natural instincts were asserting themselves more strongly each week. She'd begun practicing the fishing techniques that would sustain her in the wild, catching minnows in the creek that ran behind Ben's property. More concerning, she'd started showing interest in the scents and sounds of other wildlife, standing alert whenever deer passed through the area. "She's becoming what she's meant to be," Ben said quietly, "but I don't know how to let her go." The decision was taken from his hands on a warm Tuesday in late August. Ben returned from a routine patrol to find Ruby's pen empty, the gate he was certain he'd latched hanging open. His blood turned to ice water as he realized a curious juvenile grizzly was loose in an area frequented by hikers and campers. Ben spent the next hour searching his property, calling Ruby's name in increasingly desperate tones. He found her 2 miles away, standing in a meadow beside Beaver Creek, exactly where he'd discovered her 4 months earlier. She was facing away from him, staring into the tree line with an alertness he'd never seen before. "Ruby," Ben called softly. She turned at the sound of his voice, but her expression was different, wilder, more distant. When she approached, it was with the careful gait of an animal evaluating potential threat rather than the enthusiastic bound of a pet greeting its owner. That evening, Ben called Sarah. "I think she's ready," he said simply. Sarah arrived within an hour, took one look at Ruby pacing restlessly in her pen, and nodded gravely. "Her mama's calling," she said in the matter-of-fact tone she'd used to explain difficult truths to her own children decades earlier. "Question is, are you ready to let her answer?" The next weeks were the most difficult of Ben's life. Ruby's behavior became increasingly erratic, affectionate and bonded one moment, aloof and wild the next. She began refusing the formula that had sustained her, showing more interest in the fish she could catch herself and the berries she foraged during their walks. Most tellingly, she no longer sought Ben's company constantly, content to spend hours exploring independently. "She's growing up," Sarah observed, watching Ruby expertly crack open a fallen log to extract beetle larvae. "Just like human children, there comes a time when they need to find their own way." Ben knew she was right, but the knowledge felt like swallowing broken glass. Ruby had saved him from the depression and purposelessness that had threatened to consume him after his divorce. Caring for her had given him reason to wake up each morning, had restored his faith in his own capacity for love. The thought of returning to his previous lonely existence seemed unbearable. The crisis came in early September, when a family of hikers reported seeing a bear acting strangely friendly near the popular Cascade Trail. Vincent immediately launched an investigation, dispatching rangers to search for what he termed a potentially dangerous, habituated bear. Ben volunteered for the search team, hoping to divert attention away from his property, But Vincent's suspicious nature was fully aroused. "Habituated bears are extremely dangerous," Vincent announced at the morning briefing. "They've lost their natural fear of humans, which makes them unpredictable. If we locate this animal, tranquilization and relocation are our only options." Ben felt sick. He knew Ruby wasn't dangerous. Her interactions with him and Sarah proved her gentle nature. But he also knew Vincent's deep-seated fear of bears would prevent any objective assessment. If Ruby was captured, she'd be shipped to a zoo or wildlife facility, spending the rest of her life in captivity as punishment for the crime of loving the man who'd saved her. That afternoon, Ben made the most difficult decision of his life. He led Ruby deep into the backcountry, to a remote valley where human contact was minimal and food sources abundant. Throughout the hike, Ruby stayed close to his side, as if sensing the gravity of their journey. In a sun-dappled clearing beside a stream rich with spawning salmon, Ben knelt beside the bear who'd become his daughter in all but biology. Ruby approached him trustingly, pressing her massive head against his chest in the gesture that had become their ritual. "This is it, girl," Ben whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "This is where you belong." He untied the red bandana he'd worn every day since finding her, a piece of fabric that had absorbed his scent and become Ruby's security blanket during her recovery. Carefully, he tied it around her neck, ensuring it was loose enough not to restrict her movement but tight enough to stay in place. "So you'll remember me," he said softly. "And maybe someday, if you want to, you can find me again." Ruby seemed to understand something momentous was happening. She nuzzled his hands, made the soft rumbling sound that meant contentment, then stepped back and looked directly into his eyes. For a moment, man and bear regarded each other with mutual recognition of love and loss. Then Ruby turned and walked toward the tree line. She paused once to look back, as if offering Ben a final chance to call her home. When he remained silent, she disappeared into the forest with the fluid grace of a creature finally claiming her birthright. Ben remained in the clearing until darkness fell, hoping she might return. When she didn't, he began the long walk back to his truck, each step taking him further from the most meaningful relationship of his adult life. Sarah was waiting at his cabin when he returned, a casserole dish in her hands and understanding in her eyes. "You did the right thing," she said simply. "Then why does it feel like I'm dying?" Ben asked, collapsing into his kitchen chair. "Because love always hurts when you have to let it go," Sarah replied, serving him food he had no appetite for. "But the alternative, keeping her caged, would have been worse. You gave her freedom, Ben. That's the greatest gift any parent can give their child." The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of routine work and sleepless nights. Ben threw himself into ranger duties with mechanical precision, earning praise from Vincent for his renewed focus and professionalism. But Sarah saw through the facade, recognizing the hollow-eyed grief of a man who'd lost his reason for living. "You need to talk to someone," she said during one of their coffee meetings. "This isn't healthy, Ben." "I'm fine," he lied, though they both knew better. The first sign that Ben wasn't as alone as he believed came 3 weeks after Ruby's release. During a routine trail maintenance project near the valley where he'd left her, Ben discovered fresh bear tracks pressed into the mud beside his work site. Among them was a partial paw print showing the distinctive scar pattern of Ruby's old injury. His heart hammered as he studied the evidence. Ruby was not only alive but thriving, strong enough to travel significant distances and confident enough to approach areas of recent human activity. More intriguingly, the tracks suggested she'd been watching him work from a distance, close enough to catch his scent, far enough to remain safely wild. Ben said nothing to his fellow rangers about the discovery, but for the first time since their separation, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe love didn't require possession. Maybe Ruby's freedom and his heartbreak could coexist with the possibility of connection, however distant and undefined. That night, Ben sat on his porch and spoke to the darkness, hoping his words might somehow reach the bear who'd taught him the difference between keeping something and truly loving it. "I miss you, girl," he whispered to the pine-scented air. "But I'm proud of you, and if you're out there listening, I'll be here if you ever want to visit." The forest offered no response, but Ben thought he detected a subtle shift in the night sounds, as if something large and familiar had briefly paused in its nocturnal wanderings to listen before moving on. 8 years passed like seasons blurring into memory, each one carrying Ben further from the man who'd once bottle-fed a dying cub and closer to something resembling peace. The initial grief of losing Ruby had nearly destroyed him. Sarah found him 3 months after the release, drunk and unshaven in his cabin, staring at wildlife documentaries with hollow eyes. It took her maternal stubbornness and the threat of calling his supervisor to drag him back to functional living. "That bear didn't save your life, so you could waste it feeling sorry for yourself," Sarah had declared, confiscating his whiskey bottle and opening every curtain in the house. "She's out there being what she was born to be. Now you do the same." The transformation was gradual, measured in small victories and stubborn hope. Ben started attending AA meetings in the county seat, driving 40 miles twice a week to sit in church basements with strangers who understood the particular brand of emptiness that comes from loving something you can't keep. He took up woodworking, crafting furniture with the same methodical patience he'd once used to feed Ruby. His hands, idle for too long, found purpose in shaping pine and oak into useful beauty. Sarah became the anchor that kept him from drifting completely. Their friendship deepened into something resembling family. Sunday dinners at her diner after closing, holidays spent watching football and arguing about politics. She never mentioned the possibility of romance, though the widowed ladies of Cedar Falls made increasingly obvious hints about the eligible bachelor ranger who needed a woman's touch in his life. "I'm not ready," Ben would tell Sarah whenever she raised the subject with characteristic directness. "Honey, you've been not ready for 5 years," she'd reply. "At some point, not ready becomes not living." Vincent Crawford noticed the changes in his most reliable employee, but attributed them to maturity rather than heartbreak. Ben's work performance had actually improved after Ruby's release. He approached his duties with mechanical precision, never missing deadlines, never questioning assignments. If his supervisor noticed that Ben had lost the passion that once drove his conservation efforts, Vincent chose to interpret it as professional evolution. "Matthews has finally learned the difference between doing his job and playing God," Vincent told other park administrators during performance reviews. "He understands that nature doesn't need our interference." But late at night, when insomnia visited Ben's cabin like an unwelcome friend, he would sit on his porch and wonder about Ruby's life in the wilderness. Had she found a mate? Cubs of her own? Did she remember the man who'd fed her goat's milk and talked to her about loneliness? The questions were torture, but he couldn't stop asking them. Occasionally, during backcountry patrols, Ben discovered signs that might have been Ruby's presence. Bear tracks with familiar scar patterns, salmon bones arranged in ways that seemed too deliberate for random foraging. He never mentioned these discoveries to colleagues, but he carefully documented them in a private journal, creating a map of possibilities that might trace her movements through the years. The closest he came to certainty occurred during his 6th year of wandering. Ben was conducting a solo survey of winter deer populations when he spotted a large female grizzly fishing in the same creek where he'd released Ruby years earlier. Through binoculars, he watched her technique, patient, efficient, successful, and felt a surge of pride that could only mean recognition. Around her neck, faded but unmistakable, was a strip of red fabric. Ben's hand shook as he focused the binoculars, heart hammering against his ribs. The bear was magnificent, easily 400 pounds of muscle and intelligence, nothing like the dying cub he'd once wrapped in his jacket. She moved with the confident grace of an apex predator perfectly adapted to her environment. When she lifted her head to scan the area, Ben saw amber eyes that held familiar intelligence, though now tempered with the wariness essential for survival. For 20 minutes, Ben watched Ruby live her wild life, fishing and foraging with skills no human could have taught her. She was exactly what she was meant to be: powerful, independent, free. The sight filled him with bittersweet satisfaction that lasted for weeks. "You saw her, didn't you?" Sarah asked during one of their morning coffee rituals, studying his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd been reading his moods for years. "I think so," Ben admitted. "She's beautiful, Sarah, strong and wild and perfect." "But not yours," Sarah said gently. "Never was mine," Ben replied. That was the whole point. As Ben entered his 50th year, Cedar Falls began to change around him. Tourism increased as social media spread awareness of Yellowstone's hidden gems. The Morning Glory Diner expanded to accommodate bus tours, and Sarah hired 2 additional waitresses to handle the summer crowds. Property values rose, forcing some longtime residents to sell to developers who promised authentic wilderness experiences to wealthy urban refugees. Ben watched these changes with the detached interest of someone who'd learned not to fight forces beyond his control. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, finding satisfaction in small pleasures, perfectly crafted dovetail joints, successful trail restorations, the approval in Sarah's eyes when he remembered to eat properly and shower regularly. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late spring, 8 years after Ruby's release. Ben recognized the official envelope immediately: Wildlife Services, the same agency that should have handled Ruby's rescue if he'd followed protocol. His stomach knotted as he imagined bureaucratic inquiries into past violations, investigations that could destroy his career and Sarah's reputation as his co-conspirator. Instead, the letter contained something unexpected: a job offer. Dr. Emma Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist specializing in human-bear interactions, had heard about Ben's exceptional understanding of grizzly behavior through professional networks. She was establishing a research station in remote Yellowstone backcountry and needed a field coordinator with both ranger experience and intuitive grasp of bear psychology. "Your supervisor, Vincent Crawford, provided an outstanding reference," the letter continued. "He specifically mentioned your mature approach to wildlife management and deep respect for natural boundaries." The irony was not lost on Ben. Vincent, unknowingly praising the man who'd violated every protocol in the Ranger Handbook, recommending him for a position based on expertise gained through the very transgression Vincent would have condemned. Ben called Sarah immediately. "They want me to study bears," he said, reading portions of the letter aloud. "Live in a research cabin, monitor behavior patterns, assist with data collection." "It's a sign," Sarah declared with the certainty she usually reserved for weather predictions and gossip verification. "The universe is telling you to get back to what matters." "What if I see her again?" Ben asked, voicing the fear and hope that battled in his chest. "What if she remembers me?" "Then you'll handle it," Sarah replied. "Because you're not the same man who found a dying cub 8 years ago. You're stronger now, wiser. And you understand love in ways most people never will." The research position offered everything Ben hadn't realized he was missing: purpose, connection to the wilderness he'd always loved, and the possibility of meaningful work that extended beyond maintenance and regulation. Dr. Rodriguez's preliminary research suggested that some bears formed lasting memories of positive human interactions, challenging traditional assumptions about wildlife behavior and adaptation. Ben accepted the position 2 weeks later, with a start date in early summer. He would spend 3 months training with Dr. Rodriguez's team before establishing the remote monitoring station. The work would be isolating, demanding, and potentially groundbreaking. As he prepared to leave his cabin for extended periods, Ben felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Somewhere in the vast wilderness he'd soon call workplace, Ruby was living her wild life, possibly raising cubs of her own. The statistical probability of encountering her was minimal, but statistics had never governed the important moments in Ben's life. The night before his first training session, Ben sat on his porch for what might be the last time as a simple park ranger. The forest whispered its ancient secrets to the darkness, and somewhere in that vast green cathedral, a bear who'd once fit in his arms was perhaps looking up at the same stars. "I'm coming back to the woods, girl," Ben said to the night air. "Not to find you, but to understand what you taught me about love and letting go. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything." The stars offered no response, but Ben thought he detected approval in their distant light, as if the universe was finally ready to reveal what 8 years of separation had been preparing him to discover. The research station sat in a meadow 30 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by helicopter or a grueling 2-day hike through terrain that discouraged casual visitors. Ben had been living there for 6 weeks when Dr. Emma Rodriguez arrived with devastating news that would unravel everything he thought he understood about wildlife management and human interference. "We've lost 3 bears this month," Emma announced without preamble, her usually composed demeanor cracked by exhaustion and frustration. She dumped her field pack beside the station's main table and pulled out a thick folder marked with official seals. "All adult females, all killed by the same dominant male who's been expanding his territory aggressively." Ben felt his stomach drop as Emma spread photographs across the rough wooden surface. Each image showed the aftermath of bear-on-bear violence, a natural brutality that reminded him why most wildlife experts advocated non-interference. Nature was efficient, but rarely gentle. "The territorial male is massive, probably 600 pounds, Emma continued, pointing to paw print measurements that dwarfed anything Ben had seen in his ranger career. "He's been systematically eliminating females who won't submit to mating, along with any cubs that aren't his genetic offspring." Ben studied the photographs with professional detachment until Emma pulled out a final image that made his blood freeze. A red fabric collar, torn and muddy, lying beside a stream he recognized immediately. The same creek where he'd released Ruby 8 years earlier. "We found this yesterday," Emma said quietly. "Based on the location and the fabric's condition, we believe it belonged to one of the victims." The world tilted sideways as Ben stared at the remnant of his bandana, the symbolic connection he'd given Ruby as a promise of remembrance. His hands shook as he picked up the photograph, searching for details that might prove Emma wrong, evidence that the fabric had simply fallen off during Ruby's normal activities. "The pattern of kills suggests this male has been active for at least 3 months, Emma continued, unaware that she was systematically destroying Ben's universe with each clinical observation. "He's operating with unusual intelligence, isolating females from potential help before attacking. None of the victims showed signs of defending themselves effectively." Ben set down the photograph with deliberate care, afraid his trembling fingers would tear the image. Ruby was dead. The bear he'd saved, raised, and released had been murdered by her own species in the wilderness he'd trusted to protect her. 8 years of wondering, hoping, and occasional glimpsed sightings had ended with this, a scrap of red fabric and the knowledge that his choice to let her go had led directly to her destruction. "I need some air," Ben said, his voice barely functional. He walked to the meadow's edge where evening light painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that suddenly seemed mockingly beautiful. Behind him, Emma's voice continued describing territorial patterns and behavioral adaptations, scientific language that reduced Ruby's death to data points and research conclusions. The guilt hit him in waves, each one more devastating than the last. He should have kept her safe, should have found a wildlife sanctuary where she could live, protected from the violence that had claimed her life. Should have ignored the romantic notion that freedom was worth any price, including death. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. You gave her freedom, Ben. That's the greatest gift any parent can give their child. But what good was freedom if it led to terror and violent death? What kind of gift was liberation if it meant abandoning someone you loved to face dangers they weren't equipped to handle? Ben thought about Ruby's last moments, imagining her confusion as the massive male approached with lethal intent. Had she remembered the man who'd once kept her safe? Had she wished in those final seconds that she'd never left the security of his care? When Emma found him an hour later, Ben was sitting beside the research station's small creek, staring at water that reflected nothing but approaching darkness. I'm sorry you had to see those photos, Emma said, settling beside him on a fallen log. I know how difficult it is when we lose animals we've been monitoring. But Ben, their deaths weren't meaningless. The data we're collecting will help us better understand territorial behavior and develop strategies to prevent similar conflicts. Her name was Ruby, Ben said quietly. Emma frowned. I'm sorry? The bear who wore that collar. Her name was Ruby. Ben's voice was steady now, hollowed out by grief that went beyond tears. I found her as a cub 8 years ago, dying beside her mother's body after a storm. I nursed her back to health, cared for her for months, then brought her to these mountains and released her because I thought it was the right thing to do. The silence that followed was broken only by water moving over stones and the distant call of a night bird. Emma stared at Ben with growing understanding, her scientific detachment cracking as she recognized the magnitude of his confession. Ben, she said carefully, what you're describing, that would be a serious violation of federal wildlife regulations. Career-ending, possibly criminal charges. I know, Ben replied. But right now, regulations are the least of my problems. I'm responsible for Ruby's death, Emma. I had the chance to keep her safe, and I chose to abandon her to this. He gestured toward the wilderness that surrounded them, beautiful and pitiless in the failing light. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of Ben's revelation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a gentleness that suggested she understood grief better than her scientific training might indicate. Ben, you couldn't have known this would happen. Territorial conflicts are unpredictable, and bears face dangers in the wild regardless of their background. You gave Ruby 8 years of life she wouldn't have had otherwise. 8 years that ended in terror and pain, Ben countered. 8 years of false security before she faced something she was never taught to handle. I should have kept her with me, Emma. I should have found a way to protect her permanently. And then she wouldn't have been Ruby anymore, Emma said quietly. She would have been a captive animal living an artificial life dependent on humans for survival. Is that really what you wanted for her? Ben had no answer. The question Emma posed struck at the heart of every choice he'd made since finding a dying cub beside a fallen tree. Was safety worth the loss of essential wildness? Was protection worth the sacrifice of autonomy? These were the questions that had haunted him for 8 years, and Ruby's death had transformed them from philosophical puzzles into instruments of torture. As darkness settled over the mountains, Ben realized that his grief for Ruby was inseparable from grief for his own lost innocence about the nature of love and responsibility. He'd believed that letting go was the highest expression of caring, that true love meant accepting the risks of freedom. But faced with the violent reality of Ruby's death, those beliefs felt like comfortable lies he'd told himself to avoid the harder choice of permanent commitment. The research station's generator hummed to life, casting artificial light across the meadow where Ben sat with the wreckage of his deepest convictions. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, the territorial male who'd killed Ruby was continuing his rampage, eliminating other bears with the same systematic brutality that had ended the life of the cub Ben had once saved. Tomorrow, Emma would want to discuss next steps, research protocols, and the scientific value of documenting territorial behavior. But tonight, Ben mourned not just Ruby's death, but the death of his faith in the righteousness of letting go, in the wisdom of choosing wildness over safety, in the belief that love sometimes meant accepting loss as the price of freedom. Ben spent 3 sleepless days processing Ruby's death before Emma Rodriguez approached him with information that would shatter his understanding of everything that had happened in the wilderness over the past 8 years. She found him at dawn on the 4th day, sitting beside the research station with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at the mountains with the hollow expression of a man whose fundamental beliefs had been stripped away. "Ben, I need to show you something," Emma said, her voice carrying an urgency that made him look up from his grief-induced stupor. She held a tablet displaying what appeared to be wildlife camera footage, her expression troubled in ways that went beyond professional concern. "I've been reviewing our trail camera data from the past month, trying to establish the territorial male's movement patterns," Emma continued, settling beside him on the wooden bench he'd built during his first week at the station. "What I found doesn't make sense according to everything we think we know about bear behavior." She activated the tablet, and grainy black and white footage began playing. The timestamp showed the video was recorded 2 days before Emma had arrived with news of Ruby's death. Ben watched a massive male grizzly emerge from dense forest cover, moving with the confident gait of an apex predator claiming territory. "This is our problem bear," Emma explained. 600 pounds, approximately 12 years old, displaying classic territorial aggression patterns. But watch what happens next. The footage continued as a smaller bear entered the frame from the opposite direction. Ben's heart stopped as he recognized the distinctive gait and size profile that could only belong to an adult female, possibly Ruby, though the video quality made definitive identification impossible. What happened next defied every principle of bear behavior Ben had learned during his ranger career. Instead of the aggressive charge he expected, the massive male approached the female with what appeared to be cautious deference. The female stood her ground, and for several minutes the 2 bears engaged in what looked like complex communication, body language that suggested negotiation rather than confrontation. "I've never seen anything like this," Emma said quietly. "The male should have either attacked or attempted forced mating. Instead, he's almost submissive." Ben leaned closer to the screen, studying the interaction with desperate intensity. The female bear's behavior seemed familiar in ways that made his chest tight with impossible hope. She moved with confidence that suggested she was accustomed to being in control, holding her ground against a predator that outweighed her by at least 200 pounds. "Keep watching," Emma instructed. The footage showed the female leading the male toward a rocky outcropping partially visible at the edge of the camera's range. Ben caught a glimpse of smaller movement behind the rocks. Cubs, he realized, though their number was impossible to determine from the distant footage. "She's protecting cubs," Ben breathed. "That's what I thought initially," Emma agreed. "But then I found this." She switched to different footage from the same location, recorded 1 day later. The massive male bear was alone now, methodically covering the area around the rocky outcropping with what appeared to be scent marking, behavior that typically preceded territorial claims. "He's not claiming territory," Emma said slowly. "He's protecting it. Ben, I think that female has somehow convinced this dominant male to become her guardian rather than her threat. Ben stared at the footage until his eyes burned, searching for definitive proof that the female was Ruby. The bear's size and coloring seemed right, but 8 years of growth and seasonal changes made visual identification nearly impossible. What convinced him was something subtler, the way she held her head when evaluating the male's approach, a gesture he'd seen thousands of times when Ruby was deciding whether to trust him with something important. "It's her," he said quietly. "I don't know how, but that's Ruby." Emma studied his profile in the early morning light. "Ben, even if you're right, this doesn't change what we found by the creek. The torn collar, the evidence of violence. Something happened to a bear in this area." "What if we misinterpreted the evidence?" Ben asked, hope and desperation warring in his voice. "What if the collar was torn off during mating behavior or territorial negotiations, or something else we don't understand?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her scientific training warring with the possibility that their conclusions about Ruby's death might be incomplete. "The only way to know for certain would be direct observation," she said finally. "But approaching that area would be extremely dangerous. If you're wrong about the male's protective behavior, we could both end up as his next victims." Ben was already standing, his decision made before Emma finished speaking. "I have to know, Emma. I've spent 3 days believing I failed her, that my choice to release her led to her death. If there's any possibility she's alive—" "Ben, no," Emma said firmly. "Even if that female is your Ruby, even if she's somehow tamed this territorial male, you can't just walk into a situation like this. You have no idea how she'd react to seeing you after 8 years, or how the male would respond to a human threatening his female." "She's not his female," Ben said with quiet intensity. "If that's Ruby, she doesn't belong to anyone. She never did. That was the whole point of letting her go." Emma grabbed his arm as he headed toward the research station's supply shed. "This is exactly the kind of thinking that got you into trouble 8 years ago. You're letting emotion override judgment, and it could get you killed." Ben stopped, Emma's words hitting him like cold water. She was right. He was preparing to make the same impulsive decision that had led him to violate federal regulations by saving Ruby in the first place. The same pattern of letting his heart override his head, of believing that love justified any risk. But as he stood in the morning light, remembering Ruby's amber eyes and the trust she'd shown him when she was too weak to lift her head, Ben realized that some decisions couldn't be made with pure logic. Some choices required faith in connections that transcended species, understanding that some bonds were worth any risk. 8 years ago, everyone told me to let her die according to regulations," Ben said quietly. 3 days ago, you told me she was dead, based on evidence that now seems questionable. Maybe it's time I trusted my own judgment instead of letting other people define what's possible." Emma released his arm, recognition dawning in her expression. "You're going to do this regardless of what I say, aren't you?" "I have to," Ben replied. "Not because it's smart or safe or scientifically sound, but because I owe her the truth. If she's alive, she deserves to know that someone kept faith with her memory. And if she's dead—" He paused, imagining the massive male standing over Ruby's torn body. "Then at least I'll know I tried." Emma was quiet for several minutes, studying the tablet footage with the focused attention of someone re-evaluating fundamental assumptions. Finally, she looked up at Ben with the expression of a scientist who'd encountered data that challenged everything she thought she understood. "If you're determined to do this, you're not going alone," she said. "And we're going to do it right. Emergency beacons, tranquilizer equipment, and a predetermined exit strategy. Because, Ben, if you're wrong about that bear's intentions, we're both going to die in the stupidest way possible." Ben felt a surge of gratitude for Emma's reluctant partnership, though he knew he would have attempted the approach alone if necessary. The possibility that Ruby was alive, that his grief and self-recrimination were based on misinterpreted evidence, had reawakened something in him that he'd thought died 3 days earlier. As they prepared equipment for what Emma insisted on calling the most irresponsible field research in wildlife biology history, Ben found himself remembering Sarah's words from years earlier. Love always hurts when you have to let it go. But the alternative, keeping her caged, would have been worse. Maybe Sarah had been right about the necessity of letting go, but perhaps she'd been incomplete about what came after. Maybe true love wasn't just about releasing what you cared about, but about maintaining faith in that connection across time and distance, about being willing to risk everything when circumstances offered the possibility of reunion. The morning sun climbed higher as Ben and Emma loaded their packs with emergency supplies and scientific equipment, preparing for an encounter that would either confirm Ruby's death or reveal that some bonds could survive 8 years of separation and the brutal realities of wilderness existence. Either way, Ben thought as they began hiking toward the rocky outcropping where the trail cameras had recorded impossible behavior, he would finally know the truth about the bear who'd saved his capacity for love and the choice he'd made to set her free. The hike to the rocky outcropping took 4 hours through terrain that seemed designed to test human determination. Ben and Emma moved carefully through dense underbrush and across creek beds swollen with snowmelt, their emergency beacons activated and tranquilizer guns secured in Emma's pack as insurance against catastrophic misjudgment. With each step, Ben felt the weight of 8 years pressing against his chest, years of wondering, guilt, and the kind of love that persists despite absence and uncertainty. They reached the observation point Emma had selected 200 yards from the rocky outcropping where the trail cameras had recorded the impossible interaction between Ruby and the territorial male. Through binoculars, Ben could see the area was larger than the footage had suggested, a natural amphitheater of stone and scattered pine trees that provided excellent shelter for bears raising cubs. "Movement," Emma whispered, adjusting her own binoculars. Behind the largest boulder, about 50 yards from our position, Ben's heart hammered as he focused on the area Emma indicated. A massive male grizzly emerged from behind the rocks, moving with the deliberate gait of an animal completely confident in his dominance. Ben had never seen a bear this size in the wild, easily 600 pounds of muscle and aggression, scarred from years of territorial battles. "That's him," Emma breathed. "The male from our footage." But Ben barely heard her, because a second bear had appeared from a different angle, approaching the male with the kind of fearless confidence that suggested either supreme stupidity or absolute trust. This female was smaller, but moved with unmistakable authority, her gait familiar in ways that made Ben's hands shake as he maintained focus on his binoculars. Around her neck, faded but unmistakable against her dark fur, was a strip of red fabric. "Ruby," Ben whispered, his voice cracking on the name he'd spoken in dreams and nightmares for 8 years. The interaction between the two bears unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. The massive male, who should have been asserting dominance through aggression, instead lowered his head in a gesture that could only be described as deference. Ruby approached him with the measured confidence of a queen greeting a loyal subject, touching his snout briefly before leading him toward a different section of the rocky outcropping. "This is unprecedented," Emma murmured, frantically taking notes while maintaining visual contact with the bears. "The behavioral patterns we're observing contradict everything we understand about grizzly territorial dynamics." Ben wasn't interested in behavioral dynamics. His entire universe had contracted to the sight of Ruby, alive and magnificent, moving through her territory with the kind of regal bearing he'd somehow always known she would develop. She was everything he'd hoped for when he'd released her as a growing cub, powerful, independent, perfectly adapted to wilderness survival. As they watched, 3 cubs emerged from behind the rocks, tumbling over each other with the clumsy enthusiasm of young bears everywhere. Ruby immediately shifted into protective mode, positioning herself between her offspring and any potential threats, while the massive male took up a guardian position that effectively surrounded the family unit with 600 pounds of deterrent force. "She's not just survived," Ben said in wonder. "She's thrived. She's found a mate, raised cubs, and somehow convinced the most dangerous bear in the territory to become her protector instead of her threat." Emma lowered her binoculars, studying Ben with the expression of someone witnessing something that challenged her understanding of both animal behavior and human attachment. "Ben, what you're describing suggests a level of intelligence and social manipulation that we've never documented in grizzly bears. It's as if she learned something during her time with humans that gave her advantages in wild bear society." The implications of Emma's observation hit Ben like revelation. Ruby hadn't just survived her release into the wild. She'd used the skills she'd learned during her months with him to navigate bear society in ways that defied natural patterns. Her comfort with human interaction had somehow translated into confidence that allowed her to approach the territorial male as an equal rather than a subordinate. "She remembered," Ben said quietly. "She remembered what I taught her about trust, about reading intention through body language, about approaching dangerous situations with confidence instead of fear." As if responding to his words, Ruby suddenly lifted her head and looked directly toward their observation position. Ben held his breath, afraid to move, afraid to hope that she might somehow recognize his presence across 200 yards of wilderness. For a moment that felt suspended outside time, woman and bear regarded each other through distance and years of separation. Then Ruby did something that made Ben's heart stop completely. She stood on her hind legs, balancing with the graceful strength of an adult grizzly, and tilted her head in the distinctive gesture she'd used as a cub when she was trying to understand something complex. It was a movement Ben had seen thousands of times during their months together, so uniquely Ruby that no other bear could have replicated it. "She knows you're here," Emma whispered in amazement. Ben lowered his binoculars, no longer trusting his trembling hands to keep them steady. Ruby had not only survived 8 years in the wilderness, she had remembered him across time and distance, maintained some essential connection that transcended the logical boundaries between human and animal relationships. "I have to go to her," Ben said, standing despite Emma's sharp intake of breath. "Ben, no," Emma hissed, grabbing his arm. "That male may tolerate her unusual behavior, but he won't tolerate a human approaching his family. You'll get yourself killed and possibly trigger aggression that could endanger Ruby and her cubs." Ben paused, recognizing the wisdom in Emma's warning but unable to ignore the pull he felt toward the bear who had defined his understanding of love and loss. Ruby was still standing on her hind legs, still watching their position with unmistakable recognition. After 8 years of wondering if she remembered him, he finally had proof that some bonds survive any separation. But Emma was right about the danger. The territorial male had noticed Ruby's alert posture and was now scanning the area with the focused attention of a predator evaluating threats. His massive frame was tensed for action, and Ben could see the intelligence in his dark eyes as he assessed the situation. "What if I approach slowly?" Ben asked. "No sudden movements, hands visible, speaking in the voice she remembers." "What if he charges?" Emma countered. "Ben, that bear could cover 200 yards in less than 30 seconds. Even if we had time to deploy the tranquilizer, There's no guarantee it would stop him before he reached you." Ben watched Ruby lower herself back to all fours, but she continued to face their direction with obvious awareness of their presence. Her cubs had noticed their mother's alertness and were clustering around her legs in the instinctive response of young animals sensing potential danger. The massive male moved closer to Ruby's family group, positioning himself as a barrier between his charges and whatever had captured Ruby's attention. But instead of aggressive posturing, his body language suggested he was waiting for Ruby's assessment of the situation. Even in this moment of potential threat, he deferred to her judgment in ways that defied everything Ben understood about bear hierarchies. "She's the alpha," Ben realized suddenly. "Not him. She's somehow convinced this territorial male to accept her leadership of their family unit." Emma stared through her binoculars at the unprecedented social dynamic playing out before them. "If you're right, this represents a complete paradigm shift in our understanding of grizzly bear relationships. We're witnessing behavior that shouldn't be possible according to established research." But Ben was no longer thinking about research paradigms or scientific implications. Ruby had begun moving in their direction, not with the charge of an aggressive bear, but with the measured approach of an intelligent creature investigating something that had captured her interest. Behind her, the massive male followed at a respectful distance, ready to respond to whatever signals she might give him. "She's coming to me," Ben breathed, wonder and terror competing in his voice. "Ben, we need to retreat," Emma said urgently. "This is beyond anything we prepared for. We don't know how she'll react when she gets close enough to confirm your identity, and we have no idea how the male will respond to direct human contact." But Ben found himself unable to move, transfixed by the sight of Ruby approaching with the same confident curiosity she'd shown as a cub. She was magnificent. 400 pounds of perfectly adapted predator moving with fluid grace across terrain that would challenge human hikers. Around her neck, the faded red bandana he'd tied there 8 years earlier served as tangible proof that some promises transcend time and species. As Ruby drew within 50 yards of their position, Ben made a decision that would either reunite him with the most important relationship of his adult life or end his existence in the most beautiful and terrible way possible. He stood slowly, hands visible and non-threatening, and spoke the words he'd whispered to the wilderness for 8 years of lonely nights. "Hello, Ruby," he said softly, his voice carrying across the mountain air with the gentle tone he'd used to comfort a dying cub. "I told you I'd be here if you ever wanted to visit." Ruby stopped 20 yards away, studying him with amber eyes that held recognition, intelligence, and something that looked remarkably like joy. Behind her, the massive male waited for her signal, prepared to defend or attack based entirely on her assessment of this strange reunion between species. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Ben stood face to face with the bear who had saved his capacity for love, while Emma documented behavior that would revolutionize wildlife biology, and 3 bear cubs watched their mother greet the human who had given her life and freedom in equal measure. What happened next would determine whether love could truly transcend the boundaries between wild and civilized, whether the bond forged in a ranger's cabin could survive 8 years of separation, and whether the choice to let go could coexist with the miracle of return. Ruby took one careful step forward, then another, approaching Ben with the same trust she'd shown as a dying cub, as if 8 years of wilderness survival hadn't changed the essential truth that some connections transcend logic, fear, and the vast distances between human and animal hearts. Dear friends, if you're watching this story unfold and feeling that familiar ache in your chest, that bittersweet recognition of love that endures despite distance and time, you're not alone. At our stage of life, we understand that the deepest connections aren't always the ones we get to keep close. Maybe you're thinking of grandchildren who live across the country, a spouse you've lost, or dreams you had to release for practical reasons. Ruby and Ben's story reminds us that love doesn't end when we have to let go. It transforms into something even more precious: faith. Faith that the love we gave mattered, that somewhere out there, the people and creatures we've cared for carry a piece of our heart with them. This isn't just a story about a man and a bear. It's about every parent who's watched their children leave home, every person who's loved deeply and had to trust that love to survive on its own. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is our blessing to be free, even when it breaks our hearts. What relationships in your life have taught you about the courage it takes to truly love someone? Have you ever had to choose between holding on and letting go? And how did you find the strength to make that choice? Share your stories in the comments below. Ruby moved another step closer, now just 15 feet from Ben, close enough that he could see the intelligence in her amber eyes and the way her nostrils flared as she processed his familiar scent. The red bandana around her neck was faded and frayed, but unmistakably the same piece of fabric he'd tied there with trembling fingers 8 years ago. Emma remained frozen behind him, her scientific training warring with the unprecedented behavior unfolding before them. Every wildlife manual she'd ever studied said this moment was impossible. A wild grizzly bear approaching a human with recognition rather than aggression, displaying trust that should have been extinguished by years of wilderness survival. "Easy, girl," Ben murmured, using the same gentle tone he'd employed when Ruby was a frightened cub. "I kept my promise. I stayed right where I said I'd be." Ruby tilted her head at the sound of his voice, and Ben's heart nearly stopped as he recognized the gesture. It was exactly the same movement she'd made as a cub when she was processing complex information, trying to understand something that required her full attention. After 8 years in the wild, she still retained the mannerisms that had made her uniquely herself. Behind Ruby, the massive male remained motionless, his dark eyes fixed on Ben with predatory intensity. Ben could feel the weight of that gaze, the calculation happening behind those intelligent eyes as the territorial bear assessed whether this human represented threat or opportunity. Everything depended on Ruby's reaction. If she showed fear or aggression, her mate would respond with lethal force. But Ruby showed neither fear nor aggression. Instead, she did something that made tears spring to Ben's eyes, despite his efforts to remain calm. She lowered herself into the sitting position he remembered from countless evenings on his cabin porch, the same posture she'd adopted as a cub when she wanted his attention and affection. "Oh, Ruby," Ben whispered, his voice breaking on her name. The bear's ears pricked forward at his emotional tone, and she made a soft vocalization that sounded remarkably like the rumbling purr she'd produced as a cub when she was content. The sound carried across the mountain air like a bridge spanning 8 years of separation and uncertainty. Emma's sharp intake of breath reminded Ben that he wasn't alone in witnessing this miracle. He could hear her fumbling with recording equipment, trying to document behavior that would challenge everything the scientific community believed about wildlife bonds and memory retention. Ruby stood again and took another step forward, bringing her within 10 feet of Ben's position. At this distance, he could see the scars she'd acquired during her years in the wilderness, claw marks from territorial disputes, a notch in her left ear that suggested a close encounter with another predator. But she was magnificent, her dark coat glossy with health, her movements flowing with the confidence of a bear who had mastered her environment. "You did it," Ben said softly, wonder filling his voice. "You became everything I hoped you would be. Strong, independent, free." As if responding to his words, Ruby glanced back toward her 3 cubs, who were watching this unprecedented interaction with the wide-eyed curiosity of young animals, witnessing something their instincts couldn't categorize. The cubs were beautiful, too dark like their mother, one with the lighter coloring that suggested complex genetics at work in their parentage. The largest cub, emboldened by his mother's calm demeanor, took a tentative step toward the humans. Immediately, both Ruby and the massive male responded with protective positioning that demonstrated the sophisticated family dynamics at work. Ruby moved to intercept her adventurous offspring, while her mate adjusted his position to maintain optimal protective coverage of the entire family unit. "She's teaching them," Emma whispered in amazement. "She's showing them that some humans can be trusted while maintaining appropriate caution." Ben realized Emma was right. Ruby wasn't just indulging in nostalgic reunion, she was conducting a learning experience for her cubs, demonstrating that the world contained complexities beyond simple predator-prey relationships. It was a lesson that could save their lives if they ever encountered rangers or researchers in the future. The thought filled Ben with pride that went beyond personal attachment. Ruby had taken the lessons he'd taught her about evaluating human intention and incorporated them into her parenting strategy. She was passing on the gift of discernment he'd inadvertently given her, creating a lineage of bears who might navigate human-wildlife interactions with greater wisdom. Ruby's attention returned to Ben, and she took one final step that brought her close enough that he could have reached out and touched her massive head. Instead, he remained perfectly still, allowing her to control the parameters of their reunion. She studied his face with the same intense concentration she'd shown as a cub, as if confirming that this was indeed the human who had saved her life and shaped her understanding of trust. Then Ruby did something that Ben would remember for the rest of his life. She extended her massive paw toward him, not in aggression, but in the same gesture she'd used as a cub when she wanted to touch his hand. The movement was so deliberate, so clearly intentional, that even Emma gasped at the implications. Ben slowly, carefully extended his own hand until his fingertips touched Ruby's paw pad. The contact lasted only seconds, but in that brief moment, 8 years of separation collapsed into nothing. He was once again the lonely ranger who had found purpose in caring for an orphaned cub, and she was the dying bear who had learned to trust in human kindness. "I never stopped thinking about you," Ben whispered, tears flowing freely now. "Not a single day." Ruby's response was a soft vocalization that sounded like acknowledgement, understanding, perhaps even gratitude. Then she pulled back her paw and began backing away slowly, her message delivered and received. The massive male, who had watched this entire interaction with remarkable restraint, moved forward to join Ruby as she retreated toward her cubs. But his approach wasn't aggressive. Instead, he positioned himself beside Ruby in a way that suggested partnership rather than dominance. As they moved away together, Ben realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, a family unit where the female held equal or greater authority than the male. Ruby paused at the edge of the rocky outcropping and looked back at Ben one final time. In that gaze, he saw acknowledgement of their shared history, gratitude for the freedom he'd given her, and something that looked remarkably like blessing. She was telling him in the only way she could that his choice to let her go had been right, that the life she'd built in the wilderness justified every moment of heartbreak he'd endured. Then Ruby and her family disappeared into the forest with the fluid grace of creatures perfectly adapted to their environment, leaving Ben standing in the mountain clearing with tears on his cheeks and peace in his heart for the first time in 8 years. Emma was beside him immediately, her scientific excitement temporarily overwhelmed by recognition of the profoundly personal moment she'd just witnessed. "Ben," she said softly, "what just happened here will change everything we think we know about wildlife relationships and memory retention. That bear not only remembered you, she sought you out to show you her life, her family, her success." Ben nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. Ruby had given him the greatest gift imaginable, proof that love endures, that the choice to let go can coexist with lasting connection, that some bonds transcend species and time and the vast distances between human and animal hearts. As they began the long hike back to the research station, Ben carried with him the image of Ruby's amber eyes and the touch of her massive paw against his fingertips. He had his answer now. The question that had haunted him for 8 years was finally resolved. Ruby hadn't just survived his decision to release her. She had transformed it into the foundation for a life beyond anything he could have given her in captivity. The love between them hadn't ended when they parted. It had simply changed form, becoming something that could survive separation, growth, and the fundamental differences between human and animal existence. It was, Ben realized, the purest form of love possible, one that asked nothing for itself and found joy in the beloved's freedom and happiness.